Chapter 18. Too late for repentance. After considerable parley and much supplication on the part of the devotee Mr. Lobbyer, it had been arranged that Miss Crawford's marriage should take place on the last day of June, and for a period of 6 weeks prior to that date, the painter found his home a place of confusion and his life a conflict. Of course, it was quite impossible that Florence should herself arrange and superintend the preparations necessary for her bridal. Matronly aid was here indispensable, and in order to give that aid efficiently, Mrs. Frederick Bushby, otherwise Aunt Jane, abandoned the care of her household to a useful maiden sister and established herself on permanence at the Fountains. At her bidding came 2 estimable young persons in the dressmaking line, and an estimable elderly person renowned for plain needlework. And the scrooping and snipping of these worthy people's scissors set William Crawford's teeth on edge whenever he passed the open door of the apartment in which their labours were carried on. At Mrs. Bushby's bidding came also, at all seasonable and unseasonable hours, gentlemanly-looking individuals carrying pasteboard boxes, who were generally announced as the young man from Regent Street, or the young man from Wigmore Street, or a young person with some lace from South Audley Street, if you please, or the white satin boots from Oxford Street, ma'am. Poor William Crawford lifted his eyebrows and shrugged his shoulders in utter despair when such announcements broke, time after time, upon the quiet of his meditative evening hours. "Is there any social law which forbids a woman buying clothes after she is married?" asked the painter. "Or how is it that a bride finds it necessary to stock her trunks with garments that might serve for a lifetime? Don't imagine I wince at the amount of the checks, my dear. You may have as much money as you like, Flo, but all this business about white satin boots and old point lace seems such unnecessary frivolity." Of course, on this Mrs. Bushby swooped down upon her brother-in-law and annihilated him with feminine argumentation. "When I was married, Madame Davy had carte blanche," said the matron, "though I was not an only daughter, and though I was going to marry a hard-working solicitor. Such a marriage as Florence is about to make is an event in society, and her trousseau will be a subject of conversation. The Wigmore Street people have already asked permission to exhibit the cambric and Valenciennes peignoir they are making for her, and the Oxford Street people are going to introduce quite a new style for the Wellington boots we have ordered for riding." William Crawford groaned aloud. "And my daughter rides in Wellington boots," he exclaimed. "Don't tell me anything more about the trousseau, if you please, Aunt Jane. Ask me to sign as many cheques as you like, but don't let me know the particulars. Isn't it Owen Meredith who says, 'There are some things hard to understand'? Surely a young lady's corbeille de mariage is one of them." Mrs. Bushby did not trouble herself to notice these ribald remarks. She regarded her distinguished brother-in-law with placid contempt. It is not alone my Lord Dundreary who sets down every man who differs from him as a lunatic. In Aunt Jane's opinion, the Royal Academician was an eccentric creature, who made more money than one could suppose by painting scantily draped young women, and who in the affairs of everyday life was little better than a fool. She suffered him to rail as he pleased against the frivolity of modern young ladies, and she revenged herself upon his cheque-book. The little people in Russell Square profited considerably by Miss Crawford's wedding, for Mrs. Bushby's calculations as to material for dresses that were to be made by the 2 estimable young persons were apt to err on the side of liberality, and if a few yards of silk or velvet were left, dear extravagant Flo was always the first to propose that the fabric should be converted into a frock for Fanny, or a pelisse for Lily, or a tunic for Johnny, as the case might be. And was the painter's daughter of so shallow and frivolous a nature as to find perfect happiness in days spent in milliners' showrooms and before the counters of haberdashers? Was the society of Thomas Lobbyer, who hung about the Fountains after his own loutish fashion at all hours of the day and evening, all sufficient to satisfy the desires of her heart and mind? She seemed happy for a young lady who laughs a great deal and talks almost unceasingly, and pirouettes round the room on the points of her pretty little feet with the smallest possible provocation, is generally supposed to enjoy a plethora of happiness. But that very close observer, who, like the typical policeman, is never in the way when he is wanted, might have perceived a shade of fever and hurry in Miss Crawford's gaiety, which rarely goes along with unalloyed content. Perfect happiness is apt to be very quiet. There is a solemn hush, a delicious repose in real joy, a delight too deep for words, and such delight had no place in the heart of Florence Crawford. She was pleased with her fine clothes, she was pleased with her jewels. She had more diamond hearts and crosses and crescents than she could count. She had an eagle newly alighted on a monster carbuncle that looked like a block of translucent red currant jelly. She had been satiated with sweets of turquoise and opal, and had learned to discover a feather in a 50-guinea emerald ring. She was pleased with the carriages which Mr. Lobier showed her at the maker's in Long Acre, and the horses that had been selected at one of Tattersall's crack sales for her especial benefit. She was pleased with her visits to the upholsterer who was making new furniture for her rooms at Pevenshaw, and who submitted his designs for her approval with as deferential an air as if she had been affianced to a prince of the blood royal. There are some follies to which womanhood on the sunny side of 20 is prone to stoop, and Miss Crawford was weak enough to be just a little intoxicated by the homage she received in the character of Thomas Lobier's plighted wife, and a little inclined to forget that the enjoyment of all the glories and grandeurs derived from Mr. Lobier's wealth involved a lifelong alliance with Mr. Lobier himself. And if the modern Iphigenia is so base a creature as to immolate herself of her own free will before the hymeneal altar, she is rarely without some kind female relation to urge her to the fatal step, and to push her forward with relentless hand should she shrink from the consummation of the sacrifice. Aunt Jane lost no opportunity of vaunting her niece's good fortune, or of praising Mr. Lobier, who, for his part, was barely civil to the obliging matron, and was apt to lapse into a state of despondent sulkiness when he found her in constant attendance upon her niece. No, for the modern Iphigenia there is no such thing as turning back. The days hurried by the plighted bride with relentless haste. The obsequious upholsterer bade his men work night and day in order that the Pevenshaw splendour should be completed in due time. The coachmaker of Hatton Garden would have immolated himself on the floor of his workshop rather than have disappointed such a customer as Mr. Lobier. The inestimable young women worked as if for a wager. The French milliner, who made Miss Crawford's gala dresses, declared that she had broken faith with duchesses in order to keep her promises to the future Mrs. Lobier. Flo tried to count the days that yet remained of her unfettered girlhood, but they seemed to slip away from her with a rapidity that defied all powers of calculation. Aunt Jane grew busier and busier as the days grew fewer, and the servants' bell at the fountains had little rest from the hands of tradesmen's boys. Flo's pretty bedchamber was transformed into a chaos of parcels and bonnet boxes, trunks and packing cases. Glittering caskets of perfumery, mother-of-pearl glove boxes, and enamelled handkerchief boxes, wonderful boudoir inkstands in lapis lazuli and ormolu, embroidered sachets, and perfumed pincushions, all the feminine delights of Monsieur Rimmel's emporium, were scattered upon dressing tables and writing tables, waiting to be packed. Every day the industrious females at work in the spare bedroom brought some newly finished garment to swell the heap of silk and moire, muslin and cashmere that was piled upon the sofa. Flo contemplated all these treasures with a bewildered face sometimes when she was quite alone, and there was some shadow of sadness in the bewilderment of her countenance. I wonder whether I am much better or wiser than the savages who are so fond of beads and feathers, she thought. The modern Iphigenia has very little time for reflection. Poor Flo's life was a perpetual fever during those last days, which were so difficult to count. Aunt Jane was never weary of discussing the bridal grandeurs, the bridesmaids' toilettes, the breakfast, the continental tour, the arrangements at Pevenshaw. The only person whose equable spirit seemed entirely undisturbed by the excitement of this period was the bridegroom himself, who took matters as coolly as if he had gone through the same important crisis 20 times before, and had become thoroughly blasé as to the emotions involved therein. He paid daily visits to the fountains with laudable devotion, and he conversed with his future wife as much as it was in him to converse with anyone, which was not very much, but he still clung fondly to the companionship of miniature bull-terriers and fawn-coloured pugs, and might be seen seated in the brougham that was too small for him, taking his airing in the park with a fawn-coloured pug on his knee. The time came very speedily when Flo found it easier to count the remaining hours of her unfettered girlhood than it had been to count the days. On the last day, Mrs. Bushby went back to Russell Square to see to the finishing touches of her two elder girls' toilette and to secure the Bloomsbury hairdresser for the arrangement of their tresses on the all-important morning. These juvenile cousins were to swell the train of Miss Crawford's bridesmaids and were to exhibit themselves in marvellous costumes of pale blue glacé silk and tulle. But if Aunt Jane had deserted her post upon this last day, she was not the person to leave disorder or confusion behind her. Every arrangement had been completed before the matron's departure. The formidable deed of settlement, which secured Miss Crawford a yearly income that might have satisfied a countess's requirements as to pin money, had been executed with all due ceremony. The handsome trunks for the continental tour, the gigantic packing cases that were to be sent straight to Pevenshaw, were labelled, and Florence looked with a vague sense of confusion at the addresses in which she was entitled Mrs. Lobbyer. The smallest details had been carefully supervised by the indefatigable matron before she departed to spend a busy day in the bosom of her own household. "I am going away quite easy in my mind, dear," said Aunt Jane, when Florence escorted her to the porch, "for I don't think there has been an iota forgotten. You will see me again at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning with the children. And now, my love, be sure you take plenty of rest, for I want you to look your best and brightest tomorrow." There was nothing left to be done. No more shopping, no more solemn interviews with the French milliner, no more excitement of any kind whatever, but a dead, sullen calm. No sooner had Aunt Jane's hired brougham driven away from the gates of the fountains than Florence Crawford's spirits sank as suddenly as the wind drops sometimes on a sultry summer's day. She went upstairs to her room, and on her way thither had occasion to pass those boxes whose primly written labels had become obnoxious to her. "It is such an ugly name," she thought. "Nobody could like to be called Mrs. Lobbyer." In the bedroom, Miss Crawford found the new maid who had been engaged to attend her in her altered estate, and if, in such moments of unreasonable depression, one individual can be more antipathetic than another, that individual is a new maid. The young person was busying herself with the arrangements of the dressing-table, and Florence fled from her as from a pestilence, but not before she had caught a glimpse of the wedding dress laid out on the sofa like a shroud, and looking almost as ghastly in its spotless whiteness. "She'd want to talk to me if I stayed," thought Flo, as she hurried from her Abigail's presence, "and I should have to hear all about her last place, and her anxiety to please me and understand my ways, and so on, as if I had any particular ways, except always losing my things and leaving my keys about." Miss Crawford wandered into the drawing-room, and thence into an apartment which served as a library. The windows were all open, the birds were singing in the conservatory passage that led to the painter's sacred chamber, the warm June sunlight shone upon dazzling flower-beds, and sparkled amid the waters of those marble basins which gave a name to William Crawford's abode. All things were looking their gayest and brightest, but poor Flo's heart sank amid this summer radiance. She closed the Venetian shutters and seated herself in the darkest corner of the shadowy room. She was quite alone. Mr. Lobbyer had pleaded some especially important engagement of a business character as an excuse for his absence on this day, and Flo had told her father's servant that she would be at home to no one. She had the long summer hours to herself, and her aunt had entreated her to rest. If repose consists in sitting motionless in an easy chair with fixed eyes and idle hands, Flo certainly obeyed Mrs. Bushby's injunction, for the little clock on the chimney-piece recorded the passage of more than 1 hour while the bride-elect sat in the same attitude, with sad eyes fixed on one spot in the carpet and listless hands loosely intertwined in her lap. She aroused herself at length from this melancholy meditation, but she sighed more heavily than a millionaire's bride-elect has any right to sigh, as she lifted her head and looked dreamily round the room. "I don't know what is the matter with me today," she thought. "I seem to have grown sick of my life all at once, And if I am ever so tired, I must go on living just the same. It is not everybody who can die at a moment's notice, like Shelley's Ginevra." Miss Crawford sighed heavily for the second time and turned to the bookshelves near her with an impatient gesture. "I don't suppose there is a creature in this world whose life will bear thinking about," she said. "What is it that dreadful person in the play says? These deeds must not be thought after these ways, so it will make us mad. I'm sure my life has been all hurry and excitement ever since I left school, one perpetual contest with other girls as to which of us should wear the best dresses and know the nicest people and go to most parties. I sometimes think things might have happened differently if I had had time to think and had been less influenced by other girls." She took a book from one of the shelves haphazard, but there is a nemesis who governs and pervades the trifles of everyday life. The book on which Miss Crawford's careless hand happened to fall was a volume of the Waverley novels, containing The Bride of Lammermoor, and in the mind of a young lady who is about to make a mercenary marriage, that sad story is likely to awaken painful ideas. Poor old George III had a fancy to read Shakespeare's Lear at that time, when he, like the legendary monarch, was old and distraught, and his physicians ordered that the pitiful tragedy should be kept from his hands. But the king was wiser than his medical attendants and knew where to find the play in spite of them. He asked for Coleman's dramatic works, which his unsuspecting servants willingly gave him, and amongst which he knew there was the modern playwright's adaptation of the grand old play. He read the tragedy, and was found by his daughters weeping. "I am like poor Lear," he said piteously, "but I have no Goneril and Regan, only two Cordelias." One can fancy the scene a touching one, and the king's daughters melted into tears that were not entirely bitter as they bent over the sorrowful old man, amidst whose madness there was so much wisdom. Flo turned the leaves of Sir Walter's masterpiece listlessly at first, but who can read half a dozen pages of that wondrous story and not be interested? The sweet romance was very familiar to her, but she read on, charmed anew by the sad, tender record of an o'er-true tale. She read on till her tears fell fast, and a vague sense of her own disquietudes seemed strangely blended with the sorrows of Lucy Ashton. She sat reading till her father's step on the tiled floor of the conservatory startled her from her abstraction. "Are you all alone, my darling?" asked the painter tenderly, as his daughter laid aside her book and rose to greet him. "Yes, Papa, I have been alone all day." "But where is Aunt Jane?" "She has gone to the square to see to the children's dresses for tomorrow," answered Flo with a sigh. The thought of that bridal finery carried her back from Lucy Ashton's omen-haunted courtship to all the frivolous splendors of her own wedding. "Why didn't you come to me, dear?" asked the painter. "I should have liked to have had you with me on this last day." "I thought you were working hard, Papa, and I didn't like to interrupt you. And I felt rather melancholy today. This house seems such a dear old place now I'm going to leave it, and I love you so dearly, Papa, though I have never given you any proof of my love." She clung to him as she spoke, and hid her face upon his breast. There were a few tears upon the collar of Mr. Crawford's coat when Flo lifted her head and slipped her hand through his arm to lead him towards the dining-room. "Tell me that I have not been a very wicked daughter, Papa," said Flo pleadingly. "I'm sure I feel as if I were Goneril and Regan and those two dreadful sisters in Balzac's Père Goriot, all in one." "My pet, you have been a charming daughter," answered the painter, smiling. "Yes, Papa, but not a good one." "As good as you have been charming, my darling, though just a little bewildering sometimes in the way of slang phrases and Wellington boots. There, let me see my own bright Flo again. I suppose it's only natural that this last day should make you a little melancholy, but a lady of fashion ought not to be melancholy, even on the last day of her girlhood. I have always had a vague idea that nobody ever cried on the Piccadilly side of Oxford Street. Of course, people must die everywhere, and there are grand funerals, and hatchments on house fronts, and court mourning at the West End. But I did not think fashionable people were ever sorry. They seem to me like actors and pantomimists, obliged to put private griefs aside in order to comply with the exigencies of public life. Come, darling, We are to dine tête-à-tête today. You must imagine yourself a woman of fashion who has taken a fancy for entertaining a popular painter. I had rather be your loving daughter, Papa, and forget all about fashion, Flo answered sadly. All the feverish gaiety of the last few weeks had departed, leaving a very real sadness in its place. But Miss Crawford was not the sort of person to abandon herself weakly to any morbid feelings. She saw her father's eyes fixed upon her in earnest watchfulness, and shook off her despondency with one of those heroic efforts of which even frivolous women are capable. She talked gaily all through the cosy little tête-à-tête dinner, which the painter found very agreeable after that surfeit of Aunt Jane's society from which he had suffered of late. Throughout that pleasant dinner there was a tacit avoidance of all allusion to the grand event so near at hand. Flo talked of anything and everything except Mr. Lobbyer and the future. "Papa!" she cried suddenly, as they sat listlessly trifling with some strawberries after the table had been cleared. "Let us spend the evening in your painting room. I know it is your pet retreat, and I want to be a dutiful daughter for once in my life." She crept behind the painter's chair, encircled his head with her arms, and kissed him on the forehead. So had his young wife stolen behind him sometimes to administer consolation during those dreary days in Buckingham Street, when he had seated himself before his easel to stare blankly at his hopeless work, prostrate in body and mind. His daughter's touch recalled those departed days with all their mournful associations. He took one of the little caressing hands and pressed it gently to his lips. "My darling," he said very softly, "you remind me of your mother." It was the first time he had ever said this in all his intercourse with his daughter. They went together to the painting room and sat in the great bay window, through which the soft evening air crept towards them like a soothing influence. The painter sat in his favourite easy-chair, looking dreamily towards the western sunlight, warm and golden behind a foreground of sombre green. Flo brought a low ottoman to her father's feet and seated herself upon it, with her folded arms resting on his knee and her head drooping a little upon those round white arms. Not very far away from them, rapid broughams were hurrying to and fro in the shadowy park, bearing airily attired beauty to the elegant solemnity of patrician dinner tables. But in the painter's garden, the faint sighing of summer winds among the leaves and the twitter of one belated bird alone broke the stillness. Within the twilit painting room, neither William Crawford nor his daughter seemed inclined to break the spell of that summer silence. Amid the brightest and happiest surroundings, there is always some touch of melancholy in the atmosphere of a summer evening, and tonight Florence Crawford was not especially happy. "Papa," she said at last, after they had both abandoned themselves for some time to a thoughtful silence, "if I were going to live with you 2 more years, I think I should be a very different kind of daughter from the creature I have been." She laid a contemptuous emphasis on the word creature, as in the extremity of self-humiliation. "But why, darling?" She did not reply to his question, but went on with her self-upbraiding. "I would never call a picture of yours jolly again. Had Rubens any daughters, I wonder? Surely with 2 or 3 wives he could scarcely escape daughters. And were they hateful, pert creatures like me? And did they call that wonderful picture he painted for the arquebusiers jolly, if there was any Flemish equivalent for that horrid word? I know how horrible it is now, since I've heard Mr. Lobbyer use it," Miss Crawford had been about to say, but she pulled herself up suddenly and continued, "since I've heard it worn threadbare by all kinds of people." "Oh, Papa," she cried with sudden enthusiasm, "I know what a great man you are, and how proud I ought to be of being able to call myself your daughter. I do know that, though I seem so vain and frivolous, and I know that your Aspasia is the greatest picture that ever was painted. Bar none, as Mr. Lobbyer would say." The little bit of slang escaped poor Flo's lips in the midst of her sentiment, but the painter was too deeply moved to be cognizant of the vile phrase which concluded his daughter's exordium. He took her up in his arms and kissed her tenderly. "My dearest girl," he said, with an assumed gaiety, "we do not expect to find the wisdom of all the sages under these crinkled golden locks, and if you have called my pictures jolly, I am sure the epithet is infinitely more civil than many my critics have applied to them. Besides, you are to be as much my daughter in the future as you have been in the past, and I shall expect Mrs. Lobbyer to be as deeply interested in my work as Miss Crawford has been. And now, dear, come into the drawing-room and sing to me. We must not prove ourselves unworthy of the blessing of Aunt Jane's absence by lapsing into melancholy." Upon this, Florence embraced her father and protested vehemently that he was the best and dearest of created beings. And then, before he had time to recover himself, she buried her face in his breast and sobbed aloud. "Papa, tell me that you don't think me a wicked mercenary creature," she cried. "Pray, pray tell me that you don't think I'm that." Who shall find words wherewith to set down the glory of that ceremonial which was performed on the following day at a fashionable temple? A temple the priests of which were broadly accused of Puseyite tendencies, and on whose communion table there glittered brazen candlesticks. All the nursemaids of the neighbourhood dragged their charges to behold the splendour of Miss Crawford's bridal train, and the fashionable reporters were more than usually grandiloquent in their descriptions of the wedding. Nevertheless, it was very much like other weddings, except in the one grand fact that the bride shed no tears. "I didn't cry, you see, Papa," she said, when she found herself for a few moments alone with her father after the ceremony. "I feel myself quite a woman of fashion." The brilliant Florence did not inform her father that she had been crying all through the previous night, and that copious applications of cold water and eau de cologne had alone prevented her appearing at the fashionable altar with swollen red circles surrounding her pretty grey eyes. The express train that bore Mr. Lobbyer and his bride to Dover on the first stage of their continental tour rushed past many a pleasant rustic dwelling, nestling deep amid summer verdure, and looking down at humble homesteads and cottage gardens warmly tinted by the westering sun. The millionaire's wife thought sadly, "I wonder whether the people who live in cottages marry for love." Chapter 19. Tidings from India. For Lady Cecil, the summer months in Bloomsbury were very dreary, and it may be here confessed that Bloomsbury is rather dreary in the summer evenings, when the rifleman's little drum has beat to bed in the quadrangle before the Foundling Hospital, and vagrant children hawk pitiful bunches of flowers in the squares and streets. But are not the endless terraces and oblong squares of Tyburnia, and even the broad highways of Belgravia, apt to seem not a little dismal in the fading light, when the sickly gas lamps struggle faintly with the last glimmer of day, and shabby wanderers prowl the pavements and look enviously at the rolling chariots of wealth? Cecil O'Boinville abandoned herself entirely to the unbroken monotony of her life. She had yet to learn to find her own society and her own occupations, in common with the wives of other busy men. She accepted the lot that fell into her lap, and did not attempt to change or modify it. Her husband was kind to her, generous, affectionate, confiding, and she wished to do her duty. If Lawrence O'Boinville made no change in his bachelor habits, if he devoted his nights to study and his evenings to sleep, he had perhaps some excuse for his devotion to the profession he loved in the fact that his wife made no attempt to alter the scheme of his existence. No salaried housekeeper could have been more submissive than the Earl of Aspindel's daughter showed herself to the sovereign will of her lord. So Mr. O'Boinville told his old friends and familiars that he was the happiest fellow in existence, and that his wife was an angel. He was happy, for the woman he loved received him with a tranquil smile when he went home to his dinner, and was content to sit opposite to him while he ate his hasty breakfast behind the Times newspaper. Even in his postprandial slumbers he had a dim consciousness of that beloved presence, but he did not very frequently take the trouble to tell his young wife how dear she was to him. Having once won her to be the pride and delight of his quiet home, he took things for granted and forgot that a man's real courtship only begins upon his wedding day. If Cecil had complained of her life, Lawrence O'Boinville would have speedily set about adapting his existence to her pleasure. But she did not complain. She had married him because he loved her, and not because she loved him, and she shrank from indulging in the caprices which a wife who truly loved her husband would have exhibited without scruple. A profound weariness of spirit took possession of the barrister's wife in the bright June weather, when the days were too brief for the glory of Western London, and the midsummer evenings too long for tranquil Bloomsbury. For some time before her marriage, it had seemed to Cecil Chudley as if the serious business of her life had been done with. She was not unhappy, she was not discontented, but she had finished with all the eager hopes and desires of existence. She wished for nothing, she expected nothing. One only yearning, and that no ardent or passionate desire had remained to her after the one great sorrow of her life. She had wished for a home. She had wished to be something more than a waif and stray in other people's houses. This wish had been realized, and henceforward there was nothing left for her to hope or fear. She had married without love, and yet no base or mercenary motive had influenced her conduct. Truly and unreservedly had she given her faith to Lawrence O'Boinville. It is for the man who marries such a woman to win or lose the heart which is not, and yet is so nearly, his. Unhappily, Mr. O'Boinville, with all honesty of purpose and generosity of heart, took the very way to lose the prize which, of all earthly treasures, he most desired to obtain. If the barrister's wife had dissolved into tears at the breakfast table, or disturbed his digestive organs by a storm of hysterics after dinner, Mr. O'Boinville would have perceived that there was something out of gear amidst the machinery of his home, and would have done his uttermost to remedy the defect. But the disease which was undermining Lady Cecil's moral constitution was not sorrow. It was only the absence of joy. Of what could she complain, who desired nothing upon earth except a little rest after the weariness of her youth? She rested to her heart's content in the tranquil solitude of Brunswick Square, withdrawing herself day by day more completely from all old associations. If the days were joyless, they were at least without cares or troubles. The sordid perplexities of the past were done with. That slow torture called genteel poverty was hers no longer. An atmosphere of commonplace comfort pervaded the great O'Boinville's household, and even in Dorset Square his presence seemed to carry with it an odour of prosperity, for Cecil was surprised to find that her aunt no longer bewailed the hardness of a dowager's lot and the thievish propensities of landladies. Poor Cecil, who was so painfully familiar with every note in the gamut of Mrs. Maclaver-House's domestic economy, was astonished to behold those expensive and unprofitable dishes, which of old had been excluded from the Dorset Square menus, now figuring frequently in the little banquets which the dowager provided for Mr. O'Boinville and his wife. "I ought to be happy," Cecil said to herself sometimes, and sometimes even in saying those words the faint odour of the sea came back to her like a breath of the past, and she saw the low grey shore below Fortinbras Castle, and Hector Gordon's face bent over her in passionate sadness. My fate was in my hand that day, she thought. What would my life have been now if I had chosen otherwise than I did? It was not often that such thoughts as these disturbed the dull tranquillity of Cecil O'Boinville's mind. She had learned to think very calmly of Hector Gordon and the unknown future that might have been hers long before she had plighted her faith to the barrister. And it was only now and then that the picture of the past flashed for a moment upon her mental vision, evoked into life and brightness by some mystic power of association. She had learned long ago to think of the Scottish captain almost as we think of the dead, and in counting the years that had passed since that delicious autumn holiday, she marvelled to find how few they were. It seemed so long since she had seen that quiet Hampshire coast, so long since she had sat in the shadowy drawing-room listening to the low music of her lover's voice. The season came to a close, Trinity term ended, and the long vacation began. Lawrence O'Boinville implored his wife to take up her abode at some pleasant watering place while he went on circuit. "You can ask your aunt to go with you, Cecil," he said, "and in that case you'll have the use of her maid if you don't care about taking one of your own. Suppose we say Ryde. That's as nice a place as you can go to. I'll run across and take lodgings for you, and I'll get you a basket chaise and a stout pony that you can drive about the island to your heart's content. I want to see the sweet wild rose tint come back to your cheeks, darling. You've been looking very pale lately." It was not often that the speech of Lawrence O'Boinville, the husband, assimilated so nearly to that of Lawrence O'Boinville, the lover, and Cecil rewarded him with a grateful smile. "You are very kind, Lawrence," she said, "but I know my aunt has made all manner of arrangements for the autumn and winter. She told me a few days ago that she has not a week disengaged, and I really don't care at all about going to the seaside. I would just as soon remain in town while you are away." "My darling girl," exclaimed the barrister, "if you stay in London all the summer, you'll be ill." But again and again Lady Cecil protested that she would be contented to spend her summer in Bloomsbury. If she could have gone to some quiet sea-coast village alone, with no companions except her books and music, she would have been very well pleased to escape from the wilderness of streets and squares. But a 2-month sojourn at a fashionable watering place with a vivacious matron was something more than Cecil felt herself able to endure, and Mr. O'Boynville seemed to take it for granted that his young wife must be protected by a chaperone when she left his sheltering wing. "If you won't go to the seaside," he said, "you might at least spend a few weeks with the Mountjoys. I know they'd be delighted to have you." "But indeed, Lawrence, I shall be happier at home," Cecil pleaded. "I had so much visiting in country houses, you know, before our marriage." The barrister shrugged his shoulders. He had no leisure for further argument. His circuit work was very heavy, and his brain was already occupied by the claims and the counterclaims of Snooks versus Jones, of Simpkins against the Mayor and Corporation of Guzzleton, involving knotty questions under the Lands Clauses Consolidation Act, an action for nuisance by Tittlebat against the Cesspool Utilising Association for allowing their reservoirs to drain into his fish ponds, and by a variety of other cases in which sundry crooked and troublesome bits of evidence were, with the aid of his juniors, to be made smooth and straight for the benefit of those provincial litigants and delinquents whose rights, wrongs, interests, and defences had been entrusted to the popular O'Boynville. Thus, in this, as in all other cases, the claims of business were stronger than the call of marital duty. Cecil had her own way, and spent the long July afternoons alone in the Brunswick Square drawing-room, while her husband won fame and money abroad, and courted the laughter of hawbucks and clodhoppers in stifling provincial town halls and courthouses. But before Lawrence O'Boynville departed for his circuit duties, an event occurred which was to exercise an evil influence on Cecil's lonely reveries during those long summer days, those solitary evenings spent in the dim twilight of a dreary chamber. Before winging her way to a Sussex manor house, in which she was to begin her autumn round of visits, Mrs. Claverhouse came to take a farewell dinner in Brunswick Square. Some unwanted trepidation, some touch of unusual tenderness in the dowager's manner, impressed Cecil in the first few moments of that lady's arrival, but on asking her aunt if anything was amiss, any direct reply to her question was artfully evaded by the dowager, who became suddenly interested in the state of Mr. O'Boynville's health. Before Cecil could repeat her inquiry, the barrister made his appearance, accompanied by another legal celebrity, whose cheering presence often illumined the dullness of Brunswick Square. Mr. O'Boynville welcomed the dowager with his accustomed cordiality, and made an especial descent to the cellar to procure a particular brand of sparkling Moselle for that lady's consumption. The two legal celebrities made some faint pretence of general conversation while the soup was on the table, but with the appearance of the fish plunged at once into a discussion of the numerous points which bristled over the celebrated case of blunderbuss against saddlebags, lately decided in the Court of Exchequer, and then, by an easy transition, they floated into a debate upon the arguments of the respondents' counsel in that interesting appeal before the Lords Justices. On ordinary occasions, the dowager, who was always well posted in her times, was apt to join in these legal disquisitions, and would give her opinion with sprightly intelligence and feminine decisiveness. But today Mrs. Claverhouse was evidently preoccupied. She allowed the gentlemen to express their sentiments without interruption or contradiction from her, and forgot to compliment Mr. O'Boynville on the delicate aroma of his Moselle, or to whisper any little reproving speech to Cecil regarding the wasteful character of the banquet. The dusk was deepening when the ladies went upstairs to the drawing-room, but when the barrister's inestimable man-of-all-work would have lighted the candles, Mrs. Claverhouse entreated that the operation might be postponed. "I know you like mooning in the dark, Cecil," exclaimed the dowager with some of her native sharpness, and for once in a way I feel inclined for this half-light. Come in half an hour, Pupkin. That will be plenty of time for the candles. There's light enough for you to play to me, I suppose, Cecil? Quite enough, dear aunt. Would you like me to play? Yes, most decidedly. It's a treat to hear a decent piano after that old rattle-trap of mine. And your Broadwood is a magnificent instrument, something like a present from a husband. Ah, what a husband yours is, Cecil, exclaimed the dowager with sudden enthusiasm. And I dare say you think no more of him than if he was one of those men with red-hot pokers and hobnailed boots that one reads of in the police reports. But, Auntie, I am very grateful. Grateful, cried Mrs. McClaverhouse impatiently. Gratitude has nothing to do with it. I tell you, child, you are utterly incapable of appreciating Lawrence O'Boinville. Cecil had seated herself at the piano by this time. Her fingers wandered absently over the keys, and her head was bent in a pensive attitude. Mrs. McClaverhouse watched her niece sharply as she bent over the instrument. The slender figure draped in white looked very fragile and phantom-like in the dusk. "What would you like me to play, Auntie?" Cecil asked presently. "Oh, let me have one of your favourite reveries, your gondola, or your femme du marin, or your sauce, or some of that dreamy nonsense you are so fond of. Play something of Mendelssohn's, if you like, those doleful songs without words, funeral dirges without the funeral, I should call them, which you were so fond of playing to Hector at Fortinbras." Watching the frail white figure relentlessly athwart the dusk, Mrs. McClaverhouse perceived a faint shiver disturb its repose as she said this. But in the next moment, Cecil struck a few chords and began to play. Her aunt rose from the chair in which she had seated herself and came nearer the piano. Cecil's music tonight was of the softest and tenderest character. Her fingers glided over the keys in a dreamy legato movement, and as the dowager watched and listened, 2 actual tears arose in those sharp, worldly eyes and blotted the picture of the slender, white-robed figure and graceful, drooping head. While Cecil was lingering fondly over a piano passage, the dowager startled her by a profound sigh. Anything in the way of sentiment was so foreign to the habits of Mrs. McClaverhouse's mind that Cecil looked up from her piano in unmitigated surprise. "Ah, by the by," said the dowager, talking of Hector Gordon, "I had some news from India today." "Indeed, Auntie?" The same faint shiver that had stirred the white-robed figure before stirred it again. There are some things that can never be forgotten. "Yes, I had a letter via Marseille. Of course, when people are wallowing in gold, they have no occasion to think of sixpence more or less for postage. My letters have to go by Southampton. Bad news, of course, Cecil. Whoever receives good news nowadays? I shall have to go into mourning. Poor people's relations are always dying. I am really almost inclined to think they do it on purpose to involve one in the expense of mourning." Cecil's heart gave a great leap, and then seemed to stand still. The human heart has a faculty of transforming itself into a lump of ice at such moments. "What do you mean?" she cried, with a vehemence that startled the dowager. "Is Hector Gordon dead?" She rose from before the piano, trembling from head to foot. Mrs. McClaverhouse caught her niece in her arms. "My darling," she exclaimed, and perhaps it was the first time in her life that the strong-minded matron had ever employed so tender an epithet. "Do you think I should talk so coolly about going into mourning for my boy, who has been more than a son to me, bless his generous heart? Don't tremble so, Cecil. It is Hector's wife, poor young thing, who is dead." You frighten me, Auntie," murmured Cecil, as she sank helplessly into the chair from which she had risen in her sudden terror. "You know how little Hector Gordon and I have ever been to each other, what utter strangers we are, and must always be to one another now. But to be told all at once that a person you have known and been familiar with is dead, the shock, the words died on her lips. The sudden terror that had taken possession of her had given place to a new fear. She was alarmed by the intensity of her own feelings. "If he were really dead," she thought, "what right should I have to feel like that?" She recovered herself with an effort, and after a brief pause addressed the agitated dowager very calmly. "Tell me all about it, Auntie," she said. "It is very shocking. So young, so happy." In the moment after having said these words, a pang of envy shot through Cecil's heart. Ah, what an enviable fate it seemed, this destiny which commonplace people are so apt to bemoan, to have one brief year of perfect bliss and then to die, to live the life of the roses and butterflies, to be indeed the favoured of the gods. "It seems there was a baby," said Mrs. Maclaverhouse, "though I had not been told there was anything of that sort expected, and of course, if the poor child had lived, they would have looked for their godmothers elsewhere. The infant was a son, and Hector was delighted, and everybody else was delighted. But things took a bad turn. The baby died, and the poor young mother fretted. And then there came a fever, and in 3 weeks' time my poor boy was a widower. I have had no letter from him yet, but they tell me he is dreadfully broken-hearted." "It is very dreadful for him," murmured Cecil. "And worse for her, I should think, poor thing," said the matter-of-fact dowager. "I tell you, my dear sir, if Bamper goes in for specific performance of contract, the defendant hasn't a leg to stand on," said the sonorous voice of Mr. O'Boinville, who entered the room at this moment in hot argument with his friend. "Good gracious me, Mrs. Mac," he exclaimed, on entering the dusky chamber. "How is it they have left you in the dark all this time? Cecil, what have you been thinking of? Where's that fellow Pupkin?" The valuable Pupkin appeared with lights at this moment. The barrister's powerful will vanquished his household as it conquered all other opponents. The man of all work had entered his service 10 years before, a rough and unkempt lad, with no ideas beyond blacking brushes and a knife-board, to become in due time the very pink and model of indoor domestics. Pupkin placed a moderator lamp on the centre table and lighted candles on the chiffonier and mantelpiece. He brought the tea equipage and attended on his mistress while she poured out the tea. Mr. O'Boinville relapsed into profound meditation, as it was his habit to do while taking tea. He was thinking fondly of the red bag which was waiting for him on the study table below, and wishing that his brother Luminary might be inspired to take his departure. But that gentleman was pleased to snatch an opportunity of making himself agreeable to his learned friend's aristocratic and elegant young wife, and was relating a facetious but strictly correct trial, which had convulsed one of the law courts during the late term. Poor Cecil smiled faintly at the feeble witticisms, and tried her uttermost to be civil to her husband's guest. But she was very glad when Mr. O'Boinville, after a protracted fit of staring, which was the next thing to epilepsy, started suddenly from his seat and exclaimed, "And now, my dear Sleghammer, I'll wish you good night. I've got some very important papers to look through before I go to bed, and—" "My dear Boinville, don't use the least ceremony. I know how you work, and bless my soul, it's past 10 o'clock. But really, I had spent such a delightful evening that, upon my word, I—" murmured Mr. Sleghammer, looking at Lady Cecil, whose society he had enjoyed for about 20 minutes since dinner. When Mr. O'Boinville's guest had walked away in the summer night, and when Mr. O'Boinville had gone to his nightly labours, the dowager embraced her niece very affectionately before taking her departure in the phantom chariot, which had been prowling slowly to and fro in the square for the last half-hour, to the admiration of the boys of the district who associated the equipage vaguely with the Lord Mayor. "What a dear creature your husband is," cried the dowager, "and how entertaining it is to hear all the little secrets of the law courts. You ought to be happy, Cecil. You ought indeed. But you girls don't know what real happiness is, and yet you ought to know the value of a good home and a generous husband, for you have known what it is to be poor." "Do you think that I do not appreciate my husband's goodness?" said Cecil earnestly. "Indeed, indeed, Auntie." "Oh, yes," answered the dowager promptly. "You appreciate his goodness, perhaps, but you don't appreciate him. You just tolerate him because he is good and kind to you, and works like a galley slave to ensure your welfare in the future. But if he could read Victor Hugo like a play actor and make an idiot of himself about Mendelssohn, you'd adore him." This was the last Cecil saw of her aunt for some time, for on the morrow the dowager departed to the Sussex manor-house. Before the week was out, Mr. O'Boynville had also taken wing, and Cecil was quite alone in the big empty Brunswick Square mansion. She had been allowed to have her own way. She had escaped the weariness of a seaside excursion, the familiar gaieties of country house visiting. She was alone with her books and her music, as she had wished to be. She was alone, and she found the autumn days too long for her, the Bloomsbury mansion too big and empty. Mr. O'Boynville had no idea of being an inattentive husband. He sent his wife hasty lines scrawled on the flaps of envelopes in the intervals of his professional labours, and the hasty lines were full of kindness and anxiety for her welfare. But a couple of sentences written on the flap of an envelope are not calculated to speak the soft intercourse from soul to soul, and the barrister's brief scrawls afforded his wife very little food for reflection during her lonely hours. She wrote her husband long, dutiful letters 2 and 3 times a week, but she found this letter-writing rather a weary labour sometimes. What subjects were there on which she could be expansive? She took so little interest in his professional triumphs. He cared so little for her books and music. She shrank from putting her thoughts into words. But one conviction was slowly and surely taking root in her mind, and that conviction was that her marriage had been a mistake. He ought to have married some good, comfortable creature who would have found occupation enough in household duties, she thought sometimes. I read too much and think too much until I begin to feel that there is something wanting in my life. She had never dared to acknowledge to herself that the something wanting was a more genial companion than Lawrence O'Boynville. He is so good to me, and I ought to love him so dearly, she thought in those moments of self-reproach which came very often in her lonely days. I know that he is good and honourable and clever. What more can I wish him to be? Surely I ought to be proud of such a husband when I remember the fate of other women. What would become of me if I had married such a man as Mr. Lobia? There is a little story by Alfred de Musset in which the heroine is married to a man whom she has passionately loved. She finds too late that there is little sympathy between them, and her life is very lonely. One night she is at the opera, alone as she almost always is, and when the music, which she adores, fills her with uncontrollable emotion, she stretches out her hand involuntarily to clasp the sympathetic hand of a friend. The poor little hand falls upon the arm of an empty chair. The husband is no amateur of Mozart and falls asleep on those rare occasions when he accompanies his wife to the opera. There were times when Cecil felt a vague yearning for the touch of that sympathetic hand. There were times when a chilling sense of intellectual loneliness oppressed her spirits, and when she felt that it would have been better for her if the daily cares about plate and china and all the little sordid duties of her Dorset Square life had still demanded her thought and attention. Did she ever think of the young widower far away in his time of mourning? Did the picture of that which might have been arise more vividly before her vision, now that the cold hand of death had loosened Hector Gordon's bondage? Alas, yes, struggle as she might against the tempter, there were times when she felt herself weak and wicked. There were times when the face that had looked down upon her under the sunless autumn sky looked at her again out of the shadows of her lonely room, instinct with the same melancholy tenderness, the same passionate devotion. I ought to be content to remember that for one moment in my life I was loved like that, she thought. I am as foolish as I am wicked when I let his image come back to me. What could I be to him if we met now, and I were as free as he is? Can I suppose that he remembers me, after all the domestic sweetness of his brief married life, after the terrible sorrow in which it has come to an end? Ah, no, thank God for that. The past has made a gulf between us which nothing in the present can bridge over. If we met tomorrow, we should meet as strangers. I can almost fancy the look of indifference I should see in his face. If Cecil was a lonely wife, she was at least not a neglected or forgotten one. All things that can contribute to a woman's happiness, when considered from a prosaic and common-sense point of view, were freely furnished by Lawrence O'Boynville for the woman he had wooed so boldly and won so easily. A dainty little brougham and a stout, strong-built steed had been provided for the barrister's wife. She had a coachman renowned for his sobriety, and she had no occasion to suffer the ignominy of opening her carriage door or the martyrdom involved in the dangerous attentions of street boys, for the inestimable Pupkin accompanied her in her drives and marshalled her solemnly to her chariot after her calls or shopping. She had unlimited supplies of new music and first-class subscriptions at more than one library. She had carte blanche at Howell and James's, and had she chosen to be extravagant, might have indulged her folly to the uttermost. She had a well-appointed, although somewhat dingily furnished house, and servants who gave her very little trouble. And if amidst all this substantial commonplace comfort, the sympathetic hand, and the congenial companionship which make the lives of some few women happy were wanting, she had surely little right to complain. That perfect circle which is the emblem of eternity is not to be found embodied upon earth, and there is always some missing link in the golden chain of sublunary bliss. When all the brightness of summer had vanished before the pelting rains and dull, leaden skies of a stormy October, the barrister returned to his wife and his London engagements. She was really glad to welcome him back, even though he did seem a little bigger and louder and more overpowering altogether, now that she had been separated from him for some months. Business of a special nature had kept him away from home after his circuit work had been finished, and it was not till the middle of October that he was free to return. He came back to the old round of perpetual labour, and his work in the ensuing term threatened to be even heavier than usual. But he had time to see that his wife was looking pale and ill, and the discovery grieved and distressed him. "I did wrong in letting you have your own way, Cecil," he said. "This autumn in London has done you harm. You are looking pale and ill. If you'll tell Pupkin to put a couple of shirts in my portmanteau, I'll take you down to Brighton tomorrow afternoon by the 5 o'clock express." It was in vain that Cecil protested that there was no occasion for Mr. O'Boynville to put himself out of the way on her account. The barrister insisted on the visit to Brighton, and on the following day, which was the last of the week, and the only one on which Mr. O'Boynville could have turned his back upon the neighbourhood of the law courts, Cecil found herself whirled seawards through the evening fog by the most delightful express train in Christendom. The cool sea breezes blew into her chamber at the Albion, and she saw the lights of the chain pier burning brightly below her window as she arranged her hair before the glass. She found her husband comfortably established before a blazing fire in the sitting-room when she went downstairs, and in less than half an hour a little chef-d'oeuvre in the way of dinners was served by the gravest and most attentive of waiters. After dinner, Mr. O'Boynville enjoyed his accustomed nap, while Cecil stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit sky and sea. Ah, who shall say what a treat the sea is after Brunswick Square? What refreshment to the eye in these big rolling waves! What music in the sonorous roar of the sea after the fifes and drums of the Foundling! After tea, Mr. O'Boynville looked at his watch and then rang for the waiter. "I expect a parcel by the 9:45 train," he said. "Will you be good enough to inquire about it, and let me have a pair of candles on that table?" The waiter bowed and departed. He returned in 10 minutes, carrying a bundle, at which Cecil gazed wonderingly. It was the barrister's crimson bag. "My work follows me, you see, Cecil," said Mr. O'Boynville. "I was anxious about tonight's letters and papers, so I told Jarvis to send the bag after me." The attentive waiter placed candles on the side table, and the great O'Boynville seated himself before his papers. He worked indefatigably for the remainder of the evening. Cecil heard the stiff law stationer's paper crackle as the barrister read his briefs, only pausing now and then to scrawl some note upon the margin, or to meditate profoundly with a thoughtful scowl upon his face. She had no books with her, so she drew back the curtain from before the window that commanded the sea and sat by it, looking out at the moonlit waves and the lamps of the cliff and pier. And but for the roaring of the sea and the moonlight on the waters, Brighton would have been as dull as Bloomsbury. On Sunday afternoon, Mr. O'Boynville drove his wife up and down the cliff in the clear, cold October weather. He recognized several of his brother luminaries who were taking the air on the King's Road, all more or less thoughtful and preoccupied of aspect, and all meditating Smith versus Brown, or Jones versus Robinson, or some other cases in which their rhetorical abilities were to be displayed. The barrister entertained his wife by pointing out these distinguished individuals. Do you see that tall, stout man, Cecil? No, not that one. The man nearest the lamp-post. The man who is blowing his nose. That's Bobbin, the great Chancery barrister. The man who— And then, when Cecil had confronted the east wind and strained her eyes to the uttermost, and ultimately had gazed reverentially on the wrong person, Mr. O'Boynville went on to sing the praises of Bobbin, and a quarter of an hour afterwards poor Cecil had to twist her head in all manner of unpleasant positions in order to behold a man in grey trousers and a brown overcoat, who turned out to be no other than the mighty Valentine, but who in outward aspect differed in no essential way from other men. Lady Cecil was not interested in Bobbin or Valentine. If Lawrence O'Boynville could have shown her Victor Hugo or Alfred Tennyson taking their constitutional on that pleasant seashore, she would have thought it no trouble to twist her head or strain her eyes in order to look upon them, though even then there is some probability that she would have been disappointed in the mortal habitations of those mighty souls. Was not Lavater disappointed in Goethe, and almost inclined to disbelieve that the handsome young stranger presented to him was indeed the author of Werther? After the conventional drive up and down the King's Road, Mr. O'Boynville took his wife into bleak solitudes beyond Rottendean. They drove between bare hills, through a bit of lonely country where there were little homesteads scattered far apart, with lights twinkling feebly in the twilight, a lonely barren bit of country whose atmosphere on an October afternoon has a soothing influence on the mind. The dim grey downs and the sheep feeding high up in the clear air seem so very far away from all London care and turmoil. Both the barrister and his wife abandoned themselves to a contemplative mood during the long country drive, but after dinner they talked very pleasantly by the cheery fire, and Lawrence forgot his red bag for once in a way, and became the man he had been during the brief holiday time before his marriage, not very sentimental or metaphysical, but an agreeable companion nevertheless. "I think the holiday has done us both good," he said to his wife, as an early express bore them away from Brighton on Monday morning. Mr. O'Boynville had persuaded Cecil to stay a few days longer at the Albion, promising to return and fetch her, but she did not care to stay at Brighton alone, with neither books nor music. "I wish we could oftener be away from Brunswick Square and your professional work, Lawrence," she said, with her hand in her husband's big palm. She felt drawn nearer to him by that one day's holiday than by all the domestic routine of their Bloomsbury life. "Ah, my dear, that isn't possible," said the barrister, with a sigh of resignation. Had the great O'Boynville's fate been in his own hands, would he have had his professional labour less, his leisure for home duties and home pleasures greater? Alas, it is very much to be feared that he would not have so chosen. He was but mortal man, and the triumphs of the law courts, the compliments from the bench, and the roars of laughter reported in the newspapers are very sweet to the forensic mind. A fortnight after the Brighton excursion there came a letter from Flo, a letter the contents of which Mr. O'Boynville, who was sufficiently inquisitive upon occasions, begged to hear. As Mrs. Lobbier's epistle, though intensely affectionate, was by no means confidential, Cecil complied with her husband's request. The letter announced Mr. and Mrs. Lobbier's return from the Continent and establishment at Pevenshaw, and the writer entreated her dearest Cecil and her dearest Cecil's husband, if possible, to spend Christmas at that country mansion. "You like Mrs. Lobbier, don't you, Cecil?" the barrister asked, when the perusal of the letter was finished. "Oh, yes, I like her very much indeed." "Then why shouldn't you accept her invitation?" "But can you go, Lawrence?" "Well, I rather fear not. I might run down for Christmas Day, perhaps, and a few days after, while the courts are up, but that would all depend upon circumstances. In any case, you ought to go, Cecil. The change of air and scene will do you good. You've not been looking well since my return from circuit." There was some discussion. Cecil did not care for gaiety. Cecil did not wish to leave her husband at Christmas time, but the barrister's strong will triumphed. "I let you have your own way in the summer, and I found you looking as pale as a ghost when I came home. You must let me have my way this time, Cecil," he said decisively. So it was decided that Lady Cecil should accept Mrs. Lobbier's invitation, and should go to Pevenshaw on the 15th of December, where Mr. O'Boynville would join her, if possible, during the Christmas week. A few days before she left Brunswick Square, Cecil received a voluminous epistle from the Dowager, who retailed all the gossip of the house in which she was staying for her niece's amusement, and furnished the barrister's wife with a brief chronicle of births, deaths, and marriages, pending or otherwise. The letter was written closely on 2 sheets of paper, both crossed, and in an obscure corner Cecil found a postscript. I have heard from Hector Gordon. His regiment is ordered home, and he comes with it. Indeed, for all I know, he is in England at this moment. He is as far away from me in England as he was in India, Cecil thought, as she folded the missive. My aunt must know that he and I would never wish to meet, and hers is the only house in which I should be likely to see him. She showed Mr. O'Boynville her aunt's letter, and even the obscure little postscript did not escape the searching eye of the barrister. He asked who the Hector Gordon was who was expected home, and Cecil had to explain her aunt's relationship to the plunger captain and to tell the story of the young man's marriage and widowhood for her husband's edification. Chapter 20. A T-P-E-V-E-N-S-H-A-L-L-P-L-A-C-E. Pevenshaw Place was a noble modern mansion which Thomas Lobyer the elder had built for himself in the days when he still hoped to find a worthy successor to his commercial glory in the person of the lad who was spending his juvenile leisure among lords and commoners on the grassy meads of Eton. The great mill-owner's wealth had been lavished freely on the solid grandeur and decorative splendours of Pevenshaw. The house was in the Italian style, a noble square white mansion with a balustraded roof surmounted by airy turrets and a broad terrace walk that commanded one of the loveliest prospects in Yorkshire. No vulgar architect had designed the Manchester trader's dwelling. The millionaire of today begins life with gigantic advantages. He has the benefit of 2,000 years of civilization and may profit by the experience of emperors. Before the plans for Pevenshaw were completed and approved, Mr. Lobyer had been made familiar with all the masterpieces of domestic architecture still existing in the present or known to have existed in the past. He had disdained Stowe and had rejected Fonthill. He had pooh-poohed Adrian's villa and turned up his nose at the abode of Lucullus. He had remarked that the apartments of Sallust at Pompeii might be eminently adapted for a gentleman's wine cellars, but were utterly unfit for a gentleman's residence. After going through innumerable folios of drawings and engravings which his architect, happy in the expectation of 5%, on some £50,000, had brought to him, Mr. Lobyer made his choice with that promptitude and decision which had regulated his conduct in all the most important affairs of life. "If I can't have that," he said, laying the end of his square forefinger on an engraving of Warwick Castle, "and of course I can't, for I never saw anything in the way of a castle built nowadays that didn't look like a workhouse or a jail. I'll have that," and he transferred his finger to a watercolour sketch of a modern Italian villa in the suburbs of Florence. "Or at any rate, I'll have that kind of place, light and bright and cheerful-looking outside, but as warm and comfortable inside as an old-fashioned farmhouse, and from garret to collar as solid as the Tower of London. Give me a drawing-room 40 feet by 25, an entrance hall 30 feet square, and take care there's no such thing as a dark corner or a narrow passage in the house, and I shall be satisfied." After having said this, Thomas Lobyer the elder declined all further discussion upon the subject of the house that was to be built for him. In the space of a few months, the lordly mansion arose on the slope of a wooded hillside, and all the district wondered at its grandeur. The architect had carte blanche. There were chambers panelled with oak and cedar, sandal and maple wood. There was a staircase of Carrara marble, with balustrades of carved bronze, and lamps copied from antique Roman models. Julius Caesar might have ascended such a staircase, and would have found nothing to criticize in the perfection of its appointments. Thomas Lobyer the elder approved of the mansion because it was large and handsome, and was very slightly affected by the odour of classicality that pervaded it. He freely paid the amounts which the great builder demanded of him, and it was only when he looked over his banker's book at the close of the transaction that he knew how dearly his fancy had cost. He sent the architect to London to give the necessary orders to upholsterers, and Pevenshaw Place was furnished in perfect harmony with its architecture, but with very little reference to the peculiar taste of its proprietor. The architect had an especial tenderness for the classical, and the great mill owner, eating his frugal meal alone in his vast dining room, illumined by candles in oxidized silver branches that might have appropriately adorned the banquet table in the Apollo chamber, was inclined to think his new mansion somewhat cold and cheerless of aspect. It may have been that the millionaire was prone to be dispirited on that first day of his occupation, for the morning's post had brought him a letter from the dame in whose house his son and heir was lodged, and the terms of the epistle were very uncomplimentary to Thomas the younger. And this feminine complaint about Master Lobia's delinquencies, his cruelty to smaller and weaker boys, his falsehood and cunning, his obstinate resistance of authority, was only the beginning of the evil to come. From the day in which the mill owner took possession of his splendid dwelling until the hour in which he exchanged it for a very mean and narrow habitation, his life was poisoned by corroding cares, embittered by perpetual disappointments, and all his cares and all his disappointments had one common cause in the person of his son. He took a disgust for the gorgeous mansion whose erection had cost him so much money. His troubles weighed very heavily upon him in those spacious rooms, amidst whose chilly splendour there was no occupation for him. At Pevenshaw, the rich man found too much leisure in which to brood upon his cares and disappointments, and he was always glad to return to Manchester, where he had a comfortable dwelling attached to his great warehouses, and where he could steep his brain in the small vexations and perplexities of commerce, to the oblivion of the prodigal who was so slow to return. Pevenshaw Place, with innumerable lighted windows flashing on the darkness of the night, looked a very noble mansion as Cecil approached it in the luxurious brougham that had been sent to meet her at the Farnley Heath station. No enchanted palace of fairy story could have shone more brilliantly upon the belated wanderer than did this substantial modern dwelling. Within, splendour and comfort fought for the mastery. A gigantic fire of sea coal, surmounted by a monster log, warmed and brightened the great Italian hall, a desecration which would have excruciated the classic architect, who had devised an appropriate bronze stove of antique design for the heating of the vast chamber. Curtains of crimson cloth hung before all the doors, and the skins of wild animals lay side by side with Persian carpets and the snow-white fleece of peaceful sheep. The pair of matched footmen, who were the chief glory of Mrs. Lobia's establishment, advanced to receive Lady Cecil's Morocco travelling bag and to relieve her of her shawl. The splendid creatures knew that she was an earl's daughter, but they could not entirely conceal some faint tokens of that gentlemanly contempt which a high-bred footman must always entertain for a lady who travels without her maid. "Which her connection with the peerage makes it worse," said one of the gentlemen when he discussed the matter at the social supper table. "It's bringing the very hoarder she belongs to into contempt." The gorgeous creatures relinquished Lady Cecil's burden to meaner hands immediately after taking them. They were attended by aides de camp in the shape of an under-footman and a boy-page, and their reception of the traveller's parcel had been a purely ceremonial act. One of these Corsican brothers of the servants' hall drew aside a crimson curtain and revealed a broad, lighted corridor with many doors, some of which were open, and along which echoed the sound of voices and the resonant music of laughter. Before Cecil could follow the majestic footman, that individual drew suddenly aside, and a light, fluttering figure, brightly attired in trailing garments of pink silk, half hidden under airy puffings of blonde, came hurrying towards the visitor. It was Flo, brighter and more bewitching even than of old, with her golden hair tortured into an edifice of puffs à la Pompadour and sprinkled with glittering particles that sparkled in the lights. "You darling, how good of you to come," she cried eagerly. "I should have driven over to the station myself to meet you, but the house is so full of people, and I couldn't leave them. They are drinking tea in the blue room. Will you come and plunge into the midst of us at once, or shall I take you to your rooms?" We have nearly an hour between this and dinner, and you see I am dressed, so for that time I am quite your own. Do come and see all my new friends, Cecil. You look charming after your journey. Not a hair turned, as our sporting visitors say. Your little blue velvet bonnet is delicious, and that grey cloth travelling dress becomes you admirably. Come, dear, let me show these provincial grandees that there is at least one woman in the world who does not talk slang and is not the living, breathing image of every other woman. Cecil pleaded for a retreat to her own apartments, but the vivacious Florence half led, half dragged her to the room whence had issued the sounds of revelry. It was an apartment which was small in comparison with most of the Pevenshaw chambers, and which had that air of extreme coziness and comfort with which very spacious rooms are not easily invested. Here the classic architect had been superseded by Florence and the bric-a-brac shops of the West End. Bright blue hangings contrasted vividly with the cedar panelling, tiny gems by modern masters, set in deep frames of ebony and gold, adorned the walls, and these gems were of the first water, having been chosen by William Crawford as bridal gifts for his only child. All that is most comfortable in the way of easy chairs and most eccentric in the shape of tiny tables had been provided for this chamber, and here a party of vivacious ladies and agreeable gentlemen were grouped about the fire drinking tea and talking with that pleasant abandonment which pervades unceremonious meetings between luncheon and dinner in an hospitable country house. Cecil found the usual elements of such gatherings: 2 or 3 country squires, or heirs presumptive, or younger sons of country squires, some military men from the barracks at Chiverley, the principal town within 20 miles of Pevenshaw, a sprinkling of the London element as represented by some elegant young members of the clubs, a German diplomatist, and a bevy of pretty girls, whose maiden insipidity was relieved by a handsome widow and a coquettish matron renowned for an especial genius for the cultivation of platonic attachments. Of course, everybody was delighted to see Lady Cecil O'Boinville. The 1 or 2 people who knew her were enchanted to meet her again, and the people who didn't know her were inexpressibly anxious to make her acquaintance. The newcomer was ensconced in the warmest corner of the pretty chamber, and country squires disputed for the honour of bringing her strong tea. The novelty of the scene was refreshing to her after the dull solitude of Brunswick Square, for let the jaded traveller be never so weary and heartsick, there is some faint sense of pleasure involved in the mere fact of being in an utterly strange place. In this cosy morning room at Pevenshaw all was brightness and colour. Everybody was prettily dressed and smiling, animated and happy, as it seemed, and amongst them all there was no one gayer or brighter than Florence, that mercenary Florence for whom Cecil had felt such profound compassion. "And she really is happy," thought the barrister's wife, as Mrs. Lobyer stood in the centre of the little throng beaming upon her guests. Florence insisted upon accompanying her friend to the rooms that had been prepared for her. They were very luxurious apartments, pervaded by that atmosphere of wealth which reigned in almost every chamber of Pevenshaw Place. The marble mantelpieces were enriched with garlands of flowers. The grates were marvels of glittering elegance. The china was luminous gold and colour. The chintz draperies were as delicate and lustrous as satin. The boudoir was a nest for a lotus-eating visitor. The low Arabian bed looked like a throne. The pure white rugs were soft and stainless as new-fallen snow, and, seen through the bedchamber, the lighted dressing-room looked as fresh and bright as a chromo-lithograph. Fires burned cheerily in the 3 apartments. Wax candles in blue Sèvres candlesticks lighted tables and mantelpieces, and that traveller must have been indeed dead to the influence of externals who had failed to rejoice in such a luxurious shelter. "What charming rooms!" cried Cecil. "I am so glad you like them," Flo answered cordially. "These rooms are close to my own, and I thought of you, dear, when I had them furnished. For though you have always lectured me, I think I like you better than anyone else in the world, except Papa." This was not a very promising speech from a wife of 6 months. Cecil was sincerely anxious about her friend's happiness, and was on the watch for faint indications tending to reveal the real state of things. Mrs. Lobyer had as yet made no allusion to her husband, and Cecil found it incumbent on herself to inquire after the well-being of the master of Pevenshaw. "I hope Mr. Lobier is well," she said. "Oh, dear me, yes. He is very well," Flo answered, with supreme indifference. "I have not seen him for the last day or two. I suppose he is at Manchester. He is subject to periodical disappearances, and when he disappears, people tell me he is at Manchester. It's very likely he will reappear at dinner time. He generally does reappear at dinner time. And whether he has been out on the terrace to smoke a cigar or a week away at Manchester, his manner is pretty much the same. I have heard people say that Mr. Lobier is not gentlemanly, but I am sure that if it is correct not to admire anything, and not to be surprised at anything, and not to care about anything, except the rise and fall of that horrible, unsteady money market, which fluctuates to such a degree that it makes me dizzy to think of it. Mr. Lobier is the prince of gentlemen. "You talk of things as lightly as ever, Flo," Cecil said wonderingly. "Heaven help me when I begin to talk of things seriously," answered Mrs. Lobier, more earnestly than she was wont to speak. "And now, darling, I must run away. You have only half an hour between this and 8 o'clock, and I want you to look your best in order to astonish my Yorkshire grandees, who go to London once in 10 years, and who, in the interim, fondly believe that the civilized world comes to an end somewhere beyond the city of York." The Pevenshaw dining room, enriched by that splendid tribute which modern painters and modern sculptors offer to the golden calf of Manchester, was a very superb apartment. The Pevenshaw drawing-room would not have shown meanly when contrasted with one of the saloons of Windsor, and in the drawing-room, leaning in a meditative attitude against one of the low mantelpieces, and worrying a Skye terrier with the toe of his boot, Cecil found Mr. Lobier, who gave her a gentlemanly, but by no means rapturous, welcome to Pevenshaw. "I hope my wife will make you comfortable, Lady Cecil," he said. "I'm sure she ought to do so, for she's been talking enough about you for the last fortnight, whether you would come or whether you wouldn't come, and so on." Mr. Lobier's conversational powers were not taxed further just at present, for a ponderous butler announced dinner, and the host offered his arm to Lady Cecil, to the aggravation of a county matron who considered herself the leading personage at Pevenshaw. He said very little during dinner, and that little related chiefly to the aspect of commercial affairs in America, the tightness of the money market, the drain of gold from the Bank of England, and other equally entertaining topics for general conversation. 2 or 3 men at Mr. Lobier's end of the table listened reverentially to any words that fell from his lips, and discoursed with much gusto upon his favourite subjects, but the rest of the party divided themselves into little clusters, and a buzz of animated chatter filled the room. In the course of a commercial discussion, it transpired, incidentally, that Mr. Lobier had spent the last few days in Manchester, and that things were looking dull there, and this was all that he said about his absence from home. The evening glided by very rapidly in the great drawing-room, where there was room for a carpet dance without disarrangement of furniture, and where there were all manner of delightful nooks and corners for confidential conversation. A social tragedy might have been enacted in one corner of that spacious apartment, while the general occupants of the chamber were laughing and talking in supreme unconsciousness of domestic storm or trouble. The evening passed very pleasantly. When a large party is assembled in a country house, there are generally to be found some nice people, and at Pevenshaw the nice people were in the majority. There were musical people, and people who were madly devoted to amateur theatricals, and there was one gentleman who was great in the performance of spirit-rapping and table-turning, and another gentleman who shone as an improvisator, and who sang extempore buffo songs, which everybody thought delightfully clever, but which would have seemed atrociously stupid if people had had sufficient time or presence of mind to grasp the full meaning of the words, or if the singer had not been artful enough to cover his worst puns and his most excruciating rhymes by a volley of common chords. Altogether, the evenings at Pevenshaw were successful, the more so perhaps because the master of the house was apt to withdraw himself to the smoking-room or the billiard-room with a few chosen companions. When bidding Flo good night on this first evening of her visit, Cecil declared that she had enjoyed herself very much. "I have been leading such a quiet life lately that I did not think it was in me to enjoy society so much as I have done tonight. What nice people some of your new friends are, Flo." "Do you think so?" Mrs. Lobier said, elevating her shoulders with a little gesture, which was the last thing in fashion in the best Parisian circles. "Perhaps you have not seen the nicest of them yet.